So, welcome back everyone. Welcome to this 5th lecture of the course on human behavior. So, in this lecture, we are going to talk about perception. Okay, so before we start talking about perception, let's take a moment to review what we have covered in the previous lectures. Remember, we discussed about why we are studying human behavior and what's the purpose of this course. In the previous lectures, we explained why it's important to study and how it helps us interact with others more effectively. Also, we looked at the history of psychology, and by studying human behavior, we can learn more about how people think and act, and that can help us predict their behavior in different situations. So, by learning about psychology and human behavior, we can all become better communicators and problem solvers. After discussing the history of psychology, we moved on to explore different ideas and questions in psychology like nature versus nurture and other debates. After that, we have learned about 5 different schools of psychology, which are basically different ways that psychologists approach in studying the human mind and behavior. There are 5 main schools, which are structuralism, functionalism, gestaltism, behaviorism, and lastly, psychoanalysis. We also briefly touched upon 3 newer approaches to psychology like psycholinguistics, neuropsychology, and cognitive neuroscience. And each of these schools has their own ideas and theories about how we can understand human behavior and thoughts. In the second lecture, we discussed 5 different perspectives of psychology through which human behavior can be studied. There are 5 perspectives such as the behavioral perspective, biological perspective, cognitive perspective, the psychoanalytic perspective, and lastly, the subjective perspective. Each perspective provides a unique way of looking at human behavior and understanding it better. Then we expanded our study and discussed how we do research in human psychology. I explained various ways of doing research such as experimentation, survey method, correlational method, literature review, observation, and many more. Now the third lecture focused on how the sensory organs take this physical information and converts it into something that our brain can understand and make sense of. Specifically, we discussed how sensory organs receive and process this information. We started by discussing the challenges that sensory organs face, and then we talked about the characteristics of sensory organs. We also talked about 2 factors called sensitivity and sensory coding. We also discussed 2 fundamental parameters of sensitivity, which are the absolute threshold and the differential threshold. Additionally, we looked at how errors are detected in these sensory systems by utilizing a signal detection theory. After that, in the 4th lecture, we examined how the sensory system encodes the complexity or intensity of a physical stimulus. We also studied a particular sensory organ, which is the eye, and we broke it down to understand how it works in creating vision. We investigated how the eye encodes information from the outside world and processes it to create the sense of vision. So, what we have learned in the previous 4 lectures is how our senses work and how they help us to perceive the world around us. But just receiving information through our senses is not enough. We need to organize that information and make sense of it. And that's where perception comes in. Perception is the process of making meaning out of the sensory information that we receive. So at first, let me start with a definition of perception. Now, what is perception? Perception is all about how we make sense of the world around us. It's kind of like when you use your senses to figure out what's happening around you. For example, suppose you are a school student and when you hear a bell is ringing, you know that it's time to go to class. Or say when you see a red light, you know that you have to stop your bike. So basically, our senses pick up all kinds of information from the outside world, and our brain takes that information and makes it meaningful to us. So perception is really about how we understand and interpret the things we see, hear, touch, taste and smell in our everyday lives. It is just how our senses and brain work together to help us understand the world. Let's talk more about how our brain helps us to see things. Our eyes actually detect light and colors that are reflected off the objects. And they detect things like shapes, objects, and the foreground and background of a scene. Basically, they can tell us whether something is big or small, near or far, or if it's in front of or our behind. But it's the brain that really puts all of these pieces together to make sense of what we are seeing. It's kind of like a puzzle where the brain takes all of these tiny details like colors, shapes, and angles and uses them to figure out what we are looking at. So, when you see a tree or a person, your brain is doing all of this work behind the scenes to make sense of it. So perception is the brain's ability to take information gathered through our senses and turn it into something meaningful. It's a process where the brain integrates sensory inputs and creates a coherent understanding of what we are experiencing. Perception is all about how we interpret and understand the world around us through our senses like sight, sound, and touch. Sometimes our perceptions can be fooled by illusions and we might see things that are not really there. That's why I want to show you some illusions today to demonstrate how our perception can be tricked. And after that, we will talk about how the process of perception works and why we sometimes make errors in our interpretation of the world. So, in this slide, take a look at this picture. In this picture, we have a funny picture of a cat looking at itself in a mirror and perceiving itself as a tiger. This is a good example of how perception works. Basically, perception is the process by which our brain organizes and interprets the information that we receive through our senses, so that we can recognize and make sense of the things around us. So, perception is so powerful that even though the cat in the mirror is actually a cat, but it perceives itself as a tiger. So, in this slide, let's take a look at another interesting illusion. Can you see the movement in it? It seems like that things are moving, but in reality, they are not moving at all. This is an illusion that tricks our perception. If you try to focus your eyes on a center of the figure for a longer period, you will see that the motion disappears. This is because our brain is playing tricks on us and able to adapt to the visual information and make sense of it. So the motion happens because there is a stimulus is presented in such a way that it creates virtual motion on you and sees that the power of perception. And the things that don't exist actually start existing. It is not only with the figures that perception can happen, it can happen with a lot of things. Now in this slide, let's take a look at this image. What do you see? Most of you will see two triangles, one on top of the other. However, this is not the case. This is an example of how perception can affect what we see. What you are actually seeing are three black angles and three circles with sections cut off, arranged in such a way that it creates an illusion of a white triangle covering the black triangle. This happens because your brain tries to make sense of the image and creates a meaning out of it. This happens because your brain tries to make sense of the image and create a meaning out of it even though there is no actual white triangle is present. This is an example of how powerful our perception can be in creating meaning and illusions out of random shapes and patterns. So, have you ever read something and missed a word or two even though they were right in front of you? Well, this happens to a lot of people and it's called a perceptual illusion. Perception and illusions are not only limited to figures and pictures, but also it occurs in written language. So let me show you an example. Take this phrase, a bird in the hand. Seems simple enough, right? But if you look closer, there are actually two "the" in this sentence. One is after bird and another is before hand. This is a classic example of how our brain can sometimes overlook things that are right in front of us. And it's because our brains are so used to seeing certain patterns and making assumptions based on those patterns. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? So now look at this. It is a good example of brain study. It shows how amazing and impressive our minds can be. So when you look at this image, you will see that there are some lines with jumbled up letters and numbers, and some lines with clearly readable words. Now the interesting thing is that our brain is so amazing that we can actually read the words even when the letters are jumbled up. As you can see, it's not easy to read the jumbled up lines at first. It takes some effort and concentration to make sense of the letters. However, once we reach the line with readable words, our brain starts to automatically read it without even thinking about it. So this just shows that how powerful our brain is and how they can make sense of information even when it's not presented to us in the most straightforward way. So if you were able to read the jumbled up lines, then you have a strong mind and you should be proud of your strong mind. This is the power of perception, which is the ability of our brain to make sense of the information that is presented to us. But why do you need perception in the first place? Well, perception is necessary because it helps us understand and interpret the world around us. So understanding the functions of perception is important in understanding how we interact with the world. If we compare ourselves to flowers or birds, we can see that they have very simple needs like knowing where their roads are going or where they can find water. They have their own unique needs and ways of perceiving the world around them. However, humans are more complex in nature and have more needs. We can identify at least 4 purposes that are different from simple organisms. These purposes are related to perception, which is our ability to make sense of the world around us. Now, perceiving the world involves gathering information through our senses, then processing it in our brain and interpreting it to make a meaning. These functions include sensing, selecting, interpreting, and organizing information. So what are these 4 purposes? So one of the 4 purposes of human being is that ability to move. They can move from one place to another, unlike flowers which are rooted to the ground. When we move around, we need to navigate through different places, directions, and environments. This is where our perceptual system comes into play. It helps us understand where to go and where not to go by perceiving the world around us through our senses. For example, we can see and recognize roads, buildings, and landmarks to help us find our way. Now the second one is ability to manipulate symbols. This ability to manipulate symbols is unique to humans and helps us to communicate and create meaning in our lives. What this means is that humans use language, art, music, or other forms of symbols to communicate and express them. For example, when we write a sentence, we are using symbols, letters, to convey a message to someone else. Similarly, when we create a piece of art, we are using symbols like shapes, colors, textures to express our emotions or ideas. Now, the third one is ability to understand symbols, and the ability to understand symbols and makes meaning out of it. We often use symbols to communicate, and we are surrounded by symbols such as currency, signs, signals, and we interpret these symbols to make sense of our environment. These symbols helps us to make sense of the world around us and make decisions accordingly. For example, if you see a red traffic light, you know that you should not cross the road. Similarly, if you see a green traffic light, you know that it's safe to cross the road. Does it make sense? So similarly, the symbol of a dollar sign represents money. When we look at these symbols, our brain interprets them and gives them meaning based on what we know about them. In addition to manipulating symbols, human beings also manipulate physical objects around them. This means that we use our hands, legs, and other body parts to interact with things in the environment. For example, when you are driving a car, you manipulate the steering wheel to change direction. And when you hold a pencil, you write something and you are manipulating the pencil to write. So one of these abilities is mobility. So humans can move around and navigate through different environments. However, in order to move around effectively, humans also need to be able to perceive their surroundings and make decisions based on that perception. This is where symbols comes in, and symbols are things like traffic lights, signals that convey meaning to the humans. Humans use symbols to make decisions about how to navigate their environment. Additionally, humans also manipulate objects around them to get things done. Now, the fourth purpose of human being is the ability to make complex plans and execute them. Human beings have the capacity to plan things out and then take action to make those plans in reality. For instance, when you are studying for an exam, you create a plan to cover all the topics and then you execute that plan by studying consistently. Similarly, when a company wants to launch a new product, they create a plan of action and then execute it to bring that product to the market. Also, when you have a project to complete, you plan what steps you need to take to complete it, and then you execute those steps one by one until the project is finished. This requires a lot of thinking and decision-making skills, as well as the ability to adjust your plans as needed. So human beings are unique in their capacity to make complex plans and follow through on them, which sets them apart from simpler organisms like plants or animals. So to summarize, human beings have 4 important purposes that set them apart from other organisms. The first purpose is mobility, which means that we can move around and navigate through different environments. Then the second one is the ability to manipulate symbols to create meaning, such as using language or interpreting signs and signals. Then the third purpose is the ability to understand symbols and make decisions based on them, such as following traffic signals while driving. And finally, the fourth purpose is the ability to make complex plans and execute them, such as planning and preparing a meal. These functions make human beings unique and different from other simple organisms. So now, theories about how our brain processes information. So let me tell you about 2 groups of scientists who have different beliefs about how our brain processes information. So now, Gibsonian theory. The first group believes that the information we get from our senses is enough for us to navigate through the world. One scientist who belongs to this group is named James Jerome Gibson or J.J. Gibson. So among these 2 groups of theories, one of them is the Gibsonian theory, which says that the information that comes to our eyes and goes to retina is sufficient for our brain to understand and do whatever we want to do. According to this theory, the 2D image on the retina provides us with enough information to perceive the world around us and achieve our goals. This means that the brain can interpret the information that it receives from the eyes to perform tasks such as reading, driving, or cooking. Now, this theory is called the theory of ecological optics, And the theory of ecological optics says that the information we get from light falling on our retina is enough for us to understand our environment and make decisions based on it. This theory suggests that when a pilot is landing a plane, they don't need any additional information besides what they can see through their eyes to make their decisions like turning or stopping the plane. This theory emphasizes that the visual information we receive from our environment is sufficient for us to function in our everyday lives. The Gibsonian theory believes that the information from the sensory organs that goes to retina is enough for humans to make all kinds of decisions and manipulations. Now, updated environment theory. However, there is another group of psychologists who oppose this theory. They believe that the information from the sensory organ is not enough and the brain has to process this information to make sense of it. This group believes that the brain plays an active role in perception, and without the brain's processing, the information from the sensory organs would not be meaningful to us. So, as human beings, they need to have an accurate and updated understanding of the world around them. This means that they cannot rely only on the static information that is captured by their eyes. Instead, they need to constantly update and refine their mental model of the environment based on new information that they receive through their senses. This mental model helps them to make sense of the world and to plan and execute their actions in more effective way. And this theory is called the updated environment theory. In the first theory, information comes from our sensory organs such as the eyes, ears, nose, tongue and skin. This information is necessary for us to perceive and make sense of the world. However, this is not enough, and human beings also need certain assumptions or prior knowledge to fill in the gaps and interpret the sensory information. Information is constantly updated based on our experiences and interaction with the world, and they help us to create a meaningful and coherent model of the world around us. So both sensory information and prior knowledge are important to create an accurate and updated model of our environment. So to create perception, we combine the information we get from our senses with our assumptions about the world. This allows us to make predictions about what is happening around us. Now, when we combine these assumptions with information that we receive through our senses, such as what we see, hear, touch and smell, we can create perception. For example, if we see a bird flying in the sky, we can predict that it will continue to fly and won't suddenly fall to the ground. This prediction helps us make sense of what we are seeing and experiencing, and it allows us to react in a way that makes sense. Therefore, our assumptions and the information we receive from our senses work together to create our perception, which help us to make sense of the world around us. So, what is perception then? Perception is how we make sense of the world around us. And it is not just about what we see, hear, touch or taste, but also about what we already know about the world. For example, when we see a lizard on a roof, we know that lizards mostly stay on the roof, so we perceive it as a lizard on the roof. This integration of sensory information and pre-existing knowledge is what perception is all about. In psychology, we have 5 functions of perception that help us understand how our brains make sense of the world around us. Now, what we are going to do in this lecture is we are going to focus ourselves onto these 5 functions of perception. So to make it simple, let's think of it as a 5-step process that our brain goes through when we perceive something. The first step in this process is called attention. So what is attention? Attention is used to make decisions about which incoming information is to be further processed and which is to be discarded. Well, so attention is like a spotlight that focuses on a particular thing in our environment. Just like how you focus on a particular word while reading a book, attention helps us focus on certain things in our surroundings while ignoring others. So, imagine you are sitting in a classroom and the teacher is talking. The students around you are moving and talking, and outside the window you can see people walking by. Your eyes are constantly receiving information from all of these sources. But you cannot focus on everything at once, right? Your brain needs to decide what information to pay attention and what information to ignore. This process is called attention. For example, when the teacher is talking, you need to pay attention to what she is saying so that you can understand the lesson. You might ignore the movement of the other students or the people outside the window because they are not as important for learning. Your attention helps you focus on your teacher's voice while ignoring other sounds and conversations around you. This is an example of how attention helps us to perceive the world around us. Now, another example is, imagine you are driving a car and you need to focus on the road ahead to avoid any obstacles or accidents. But there are many other things happening around you, like the radio is playing, people are talking, and other cars honking, and many more. So if you try to pay attention to all of these things at the same time, it will be overwhelming and distract you from driving safely. So you need to use your attention to filter out the information that is not important at that moment and focus on the information that is relevant and necessary for driving. This is how attention helps us make decisions about which information to process and which to ignore. Okay, so the second step in perception is to figure out where the objects are located in the external environment. This means our brain needs to determine the location of the objects that we perceive. For example, if you see a book on a table, your brain needs to figure out where the table is located in the room and where the book is located on the table. This helps us to interact with the world around us and make sense of the information we are receiving. This means we need to be able to distinguish between what is in the foreground and what is in the background. Once we can do this, we can start to understand what we are seeing and make sense of it. For example, if you are looking at a picture of a dog in a park, you need to be able to distinguish the dog from the trees and grass in the background in order to understand the scene. If you cannot separate the dog from the background, you might not be able to make sense of the picture. Now the third step in perception is recognizing what objects you are looking at the environment. This is called recognition, and recognition means being able to identify the objects you are seeing and making sense of them. For example, if you see an animal, you should be able to recognize whether it's a dog, a cat, or a horse. The perception process starts with attention, then localizing the objects, and then recognizing them. So recognition is the ability to identify or distinguish different objects in our surroundings, such as tree, cow, person, and so on. Without recognition, everything would appear the same to us, right? So that is the third step in perception. And the next two steps in perception is related to how our brain works with certain assumptions when processing and updating information from the environment. These assumptions helps us to make sense of the world around us and make decisions without having to think too hard about every single thing we encounter. Assumptions are the ideas or expectations that our brain automatically generates based on our past experiences and knowledge. For example, when we see a chair, our brain assumes that it's something we can sit on because that's what chairs are usually used for. And the fourth one in perception is abstraction. So what is abstraction? Abstraction is the process of focusing on only the most important features of an object in the environment and ignoring the other details that are not relevant. For example, if you see a dog in the park, you will focus on its features such as its tail, its ear and its general shape rather than noticing the specific color of its eyes or the pattern on its nose. This is because these specific details are not as important for you to recognize the dog as a dog. So when you look at a chair, your brain creates an image of what a chair should look like based on your previous experiences with chairs. And this image is called a prototype. Then your brain decides which features of the chair to pay attention, such as its shape or the fact that it's a chair. Your brain then compares this information to what it knows about chairs, like their typical angles and lines, to make assumptions about what you are seeing. It also considers what you can do with the chair or its affordance, like sitting on it. So every time you see a chair, you actually don't perceive the whole chair. You perceive parts of it, right? For example, there is a beanbag. So now, how you make an idea that this is a chair? What is the function of the chair? Or what is the idea of a chair? A chair is something in which you can sit. So it has to have a place where you can sit, and if the beanbag has a place where you can sit, which is called the affordance. Affordance means what the object can be used for or what it seems like it is naturally meant for. In the case of a beanbag, its affordance for sitting makes it seem like a kind of chair. So affordance is what the object affords or what the object naturally seems to be like. And so this is called abstraction. Abstraction is when our brain simplifies the information it receives from the external world by focusing on the most important features of the object and ignoring the irrelevant ones. It's like making a basic outline of what something looks like without going into too much detail. So the last one of the assumptions is called constancy. So what is constancy? Constancy is maintaining certain features. Let me explain constancy in more simpler terms. Constancy is the ability of our brain to maintain the same perception of an object even when it appears differently. For example, if you look at a door from different angles or distance, the image of the door that falls on your eye changes, but your brain still perceives it as a door. Similarly, when you see a friend coming towards you from a distance, the image on your retina changes, but your brain doesn't perceive your friend is growing or shrinking. This ability of the brain to maintain a consistent perception of object is called constancy. Constancy is the ability of our brain to maintain the idea or assumption of an object's certain features even if it appears differently in different situations. Okay, so let's talk about the first step in perception, which is called attention. So what is attention? Well, it's like a filter that your brain puts in front of all the information that's coming in. It filters out the important information from the not so important information for us to focus on. For example, if you are in a crowded place, your brain will help you to focus on the person you are talking to, while filtering out all other noises and distractions around you. Attention is like a mental filter in our brain that helps us select certain stimuli and ignore others. So think of it as a filter. Now, what is filter? Have you made tea before? Now, if you made tea before, you use a filter for separating the tea and the tea leaves. Attention is a thing like that. It separates what you want and what you don't want. So when we perceive the world, the first step is called attention. Attention is like a filter in your brain that separates the information you want to pay attention from the information that you don't want to pay attention. This filter is based on our assumptions and motivations. For instance, if you are reading a book in a noisy room, your attention will filter out the noise and focus only on the book. For example, if you have 4 inputs like R1, R2, R3 and R4 and you only want to pay attention to R3, then the attention filter will only allow R3 to pass through. Attention filter depends upon your cognitive resources and the limitations. So the study of attention is mainly concerned with how much cognitive resources you have and the limitations of those resources. Okay, so let me explain cognitive resources and the limitations with example. Imagine you are studying for a test and your friend is playing loud music in the next room. Your attention filter is being bombarded with both the sound of the music and the text you are reading. But you can only focus on one thing at a time. So, you need to allocate your cognitive resources effectively. You may choose to use earplugs to block out the music, or you may choose to move to a quieter room. This is an example of how cognitive resources and limitations come into play when it comes to attention. Just like how our senses have the limitation on what information they can take in, our brain also has the same limitations on how much information it can process at any given time. So we have to be selective about on what we pay attention and what we ignore. So for example, the opponent process theory says that if you see red color immediately you will see the green color, right? And so it has the limitation that if I overexcite the red color, then after a point of time it becomes saturated and you start seeing green. So this is the limitation of the cone for that matter, and so there are certain limitations with the ear also. There are certain limitations with all of these sensory organs. Now, attention is the process by which our brain filters and selects important information from the surrounding environment based on our cognitive resources and the limitations of our sensory organs. It is like a gatekeeper that only allows certain stimuli to enter our consciousness while filtering out others. Our cognitive resources refer to the amount of mental energy that we have at a given time to devote to all the tasks and information we encounter. So what is attention? Attention is sometimes synonymously used with something called mental concentration. Remember all those days when we were sitting in a class and the teacher used to say, "Pay attention." What does it mean? It means to concentrate, to focus on what you are doing, and once you focus on what you are doing, you put all your mental energy into one work. This means that you are able to filter out all other stimuli around you and you can focus solely on the task at hand. For example, when you are studying for a test, paying attention means that you are focusing on your studying and not getting distracted by your phone or other people talking around you. Now, here is an interesting question. Can our concentration level improve with practice? I would like to encourage you to think about this question and share your thoughts on the comment section so that later on we will discuss whether it is possible to improve our concentration level with practice or not. So let's keep this question open for now and come back to this later on. So attention itself is of two types. You have something called selective attention and you have something called sustained attention. Mostly we deal with something called selective attention. So what is selective attention? Selective attention is when you choose to focus on certain things while ignoring others. For example, when you are watching a movie, you focus on the characters and the storyline while ignoring the sounds around you. And sustained attention is when you concentrate on one piece of information or stimuli for an extended period of time. For instance, when you are reading a book, you focus on the words and keep your attention on the story for a long time. So now let's describe selective attention in more detail. Selective attention is when we choose to focus our attention on one or few tasks or events instead of trying to process everything at once. This means that we prioritize certain tasks and consciously ignore less information from other competing tasks. as attention researcher Hal Pashley in 1998 puts it like this: at any given moment, people's awareness encompasses only a tiny proportion of the stimuli impinging on their sensory system. So, as explained Hal Pashley, at any given moment, people are only aware of a very small amount of sensory information that is being processed by their brain. For example, when you are reading a book, you are selectively attending to the words on the page and not paying attention to the sounds outside your window or the texture of your shirt. Then visual perception. So what is visual perception? In visual perception, we use our eyes to perceive objects in the environment. Similar to how we selectively pay attention to certain things and ignore others, and we do the same when we look at objects. We analyze their shapes and forms and compare them to mental images or representations we have stored in our mind. This helps us quickly recognize and identify objects without needing to think too hard. For instance, when you see a dog, you instantly know that it's a dog because you have seen and identified dog before. This is how our ability to perceive objects works. Similarly, if you see a chair, you automatically know it's a chair because you have seen and recognized chair before. This is how object perception works. When we are reading how attention process really works, or how does the eye work for that matter. Now the process of seeing starts with visual scanning. The process of seeing involves brief moments where the eyes focus on a certain spot without moving our eyes, which is called a fixation, and then quickly move to another spot, which is called saccade. It's like the eye is taking snapshots of different parts of the text and putting them together to create the whole picture. And this happens because our eyes need to focus on different parts of the text in order for us to read it properly. Think of it like a camera which is taking pictures of different parts of the scene and then stitching them together to create a panoramic view. In visual perception, when we look at a scene with multiple objects, our eyes first focus on one object, which is called a fixation. Then our eyes quickly move to the next object without focusing on the space in between. This quick jump is called saccade. So fixation is the process of staying focused on one object, and saccade is the quick jump to the next object. It's like looking at a picture book and focusing on one image before quickly moving on to the next one. So when we look at something, our eyes don't randomly focus on any part of the scene. Instead, it's a deliberate process. Our eyes naturally fixate on the areas that hold the most important information. For instance, when we see a picture of a group of people, our eyes are drawn to the faces because they provide crucial details like expression, emotions, and identity. So if we use a device called an eye tracker and observe someone looking at an object and picture, we will notice that their eyes move in a specific pattern. This pattern is not random, but rather it follows a predetermined strategy where the eyes focus on the areas that contain the most useful information. In other words, the eyes are smart and know where to look to gather the most relevant data. When the eye tracker is used to monitor eye movements, it shows that the eyes tend to focus on the areas with the most information or details. After that, the divided attention. So in addition to eye movement, there is another type of attention which is called divided attention, and it allows us to selectively focus on specific visual stimuli without the need for eye movement. It enables us to divide our attention among different objects and events in our visual field without physically shifting our gaze. For example, imagine you are at a busy supermarket looking for a specific item on the shelf. your eyes remain fixed on a central point, but your attention is divided as you scan the surrounding area and searching for the desired product. Despite of not moving your eyes, you are able to selectively process the visual information from different objects and quickly identify the item you are looking for. The ability to divide attention in a visual perception demonstrates the flexibility and efficiency of our attention system. It allows us to allocate our cognitive resources to relevant stimuli while filtering out distractions. By selectively attending to specific objects, we can enhance our processing of important visual information and effectively perform tasks that require simultaneous monitoring or searching. Understanding and utilizing divided attention effectively can enhance our ability to process visual information and perform various tasks in our everyday lives. In the process of perception, the second step is localization, which refers to determining the location of objects in the external environment. So why do you need localization? Localization is important because it helps us to solve various problems related to perception. It allows us to understand not only what objects are present, but also why they are located in the space. Let's understand the significance of localization with an example. Imagine you are in a park and you see a tree and a bench. The process of localization helps you determine not only that there is a tree and a bench, but also where exactly they are positioned in the park. This information enables you to navigate your surroundings, interact with objects, and make sense of your environment. Now, why do you need localization? The answer lies in our ability to navigate through cluttered environments. We need this localization because human beings navigate through cluttered environments, and if they can locate objects in the external environment, they can pass through complex environments or they can navigate through complex environments. Imagine you are in a crowded market with various shops, people, and objects all around. In order to navigate through this chaotic environment and find what you are actually looking for, you need to be able to locate the object of interest. For example, if you are searching for a specific store, you rely on your ability to locate its position among other shops. This localization allows you to navigate through the clutter and reach your destination efficiently. Localization is essential in our daily lives because it helps us make sense of complex environments. Whether it's finding our way through a busy street or locating items on a store shelf or identifying landmarks in an unfamiliar place, our ability to accurately determine the location of objects enables us to navigate effectively. Localization is indeed an important aspect of perception as it enables humans to navigate and interact with complex environment. By utilizing information received from our senses and making certain assumptions, we can determine the presence and location of objects in relation to ourselves. To better understand localization, let's think of it in terms of a map. When you look at a map, you can identify the landmarks and surroundings, which allows you to navigate your way through the environment. So localization is important because it helps in navigating people. Also, it's important for grasping objects. So secondly, localization is essential for grasping objects. Localization is important because it helps you in grasping objects or touching objects. If there is an object in front of you and if you cannot see where it is, you will be fumbling around. So localization helps us precisely to determine the location of objects and enable us to effortlessly reach out and grasp them. So what is localization? Localization refers to the process of accurately determining the location of the objects in the external environment. At first, it is achieved by separating the objects from one another and then separating each from the background. So to achieve localization, there are two main steps involved. The first step is separating the objects from one another, and the second step in localization, which is separating each object from the background. Now, by successfully completing these two steps of localization, which are separating objects from one another and separating objects from the background, we can accurately identify and determine the position of each object in the external environment. This ability to localize objects is very crucial for various tasks, which includes interacting with them, reaching out to them, and effectively navigating and manipulating our surroundings. Now, the separation of object. So the simplest way our brain organizes what we see is by dividing a stimulus into different parts. So when we look at something with two or more distinct areas, we tend to perceive one part as the main focus, which is called the figure, while the rest becomes the background. This perceptual organization is fundamental to how we interpret visual information. So the ability to perceive the figure and background in a stimulus allows us to recognize objects and make sense of the visual world around us. Now, figure-ground relationship. So when we perceive figure-ground relationship, the figure refers to the object of interest that appears more solid and stand out in front of the background. In contrast, the background is the surrounding region that appears to be behind the figure. Let's take a look at an example of reversible image. In such images, you may see different objects or figures depending on how you interpret the visual sign. For instance, consider the famous image of the Rubin's vase illusion. In this image, if you consider the black as the background, the moment you think the black is the background, which means that this figure is a cutout and you see two people staring at each other. Can you see the two people staring at each other? But the moment we see the white as the background and black as the figure, you see a vase. So this is basically, if black is the background, you see two faces, and if white is the background, you see a vase. This is called a reversible image. Can you see the two faces which are seeing each other? Yes, that is what perception is all about, and that is called localization or separating the figure from the background. In this case, we can see the vase as the figure or the face as the figure depending on how we mentally separate and perceive the object from its surrounding context. So figure-ground relationship play an important role in how we perceive and interpret visual information. And it allows us to distinguish objects of interest from their background and make sense of the world around us. In this case, our brain uses signs such as color and shape to determine what the figure is and what is the background. The way we perceive the image is influenced by these signs and our previous experiences. The reversible image example illustrates the concept of localization and the perceptual process of separating the figure from the background. The example of this reversible figure demonstrates the role of figure-ground separation in perception and highlights the importance of the second step in localization, which involves separating the figure from the background. It shows how different interpretation can arise depending on the foreground and background relationship. Additionally, the study of perceptual organization principles helps us to understand how our brain organizes and makes sense of visual information. Gestalt psychologists studied how our brain naturally groups objects together in perception. They discovered that how we group objects together, because perception or this localization requires not only separating objects from one another, but also organizing objects together so that we can view them. Our brain has a tendency to view objects as part of a larger whole rather than as isolated elements. To help us understand how this grouping process works, Gestalt psychologists proposed certain laws or principles that guide our perception. These rules are known as Gestalt principles or Gestalt laws. So now let's discuss in detail what are those Gestalt principles or Gestalt laws. One of the Gestalt principles is the principle of proximity. It means that objects that are close together as being part of same group. So according to this principle, objects that are close to each other tend to be perceived as a group. For example, imagine a group of dots arranged in a scattered manner. So when these dots are closer to one another, we perceive them as forming a shape or a pattern. Now the next one is the principle of similarity. It means that objects similar in appearance are perceived as being part of the same group. So objects that share similar features such as shape, color or size are perceived as belonging to the same group. For instance, if you see a group of squares and circles and the squares are all red while the circles are all blue, your brain will naturally group the red squares together and the blue circles together. Now the third principle is continuation or continuity. It means that objects that form a continuous form are perceived as the same group. Our brain tends to perceive objects that form a continuous or smooth shape as belonging to the same group. Imagine a wavy line that is partially hidden by another object. Despite the interruption in the line, our brain perceives it as a continuous curve. This principle helps us perceive objects as cohesive and complete even when they are partially unclear. The fourth principle is closure, which is another important principle. It's like top-down processing. We can fill the gaps in if we can recognize it. Our brain has a tendency to fill in missing information or perceive incomplete shapes as complete. For example, imagine a circle with a small gap. Our brain closes the gap and perceives it as a complete circle. These principles allow us to recognize objects even when they are not fully presented. These Gestalt principles help us understand how our brain organizes visual information and perceives objects as meaningful groups. Now, understanding these principles helps us make sense of the visual world around us. Now in this slide, let's look at these four figures or image. What does this really mean? This is proximity. So when I show you this, what do you see? We see bunch of lines which are parallel lines, and all of these lines are independent of each another. But you group them together and this is called simple proximity rule. And now here, when I ask you what you see there, and you say that I have two groups of triangles and one group of circle, and this is called the idea of similarity. Similarly, when I show you this, most people will see that it is a curve or complex function curve. This is not a sine curve, but it's a cosine curve. Despite the fact that one part of the curve is different from the other, our brain recognizes the overall continuity and perceives it as a single continuous curve. Now, similarly, when I show you this, what do you see? You see three interconnected dumbbells. Our brain naturally groups them together as one entity rather than perceiving them as separate balls connected by sticks. So the idea of grouping them together is what is called Gestalt. So what Gestalt says is how we make perception, or how do we do localization. Our eyes not only perceive objects in 2 dimensions, but also have the ability to perceive depth and see the world in 3 dimensions. So perceiving distance requires depth cues, different kind of visual information that logically or mathematically provides information about some objects on depth. Now let me explain what perceiving distance is and how our brain uses inputs from both eyes to produce a feeling of 3-dimensional space. When you look at something, it is projected in 2D onto the retina of each eye. the retina is made up of light-sensitive cells that aid in picture acquisition. Our perception of the world, however, is not limited to this 2D representation. Our brain combines information from both eyes and employs signals or clues to generate a sensation of depth and 3D image. These cues are known as monocular cues, and because of these monocular cues, they can be perceived individually by each eye. Now, let's describe monocular cues. So, one such cue is called relative size. If an image contains an array of similar objects that differ in size, the viewer intercepts the smaller object as being further away. Let's understand this with an example. Imagine you are looking at a group of objects in the distance, such as houses. If one house appears smaller compared to the other, your brain interprets it as being further away. This is because, based on our previous experiences, we know that objects that are further away tend to appear smaller. So the brain uses the relative size of objects as a cue to estimate their distance. Another cue is called interposition or overlap. If an object is positioned so that it obstructs the view of the other, the viewer perceives the overlapping objects as being nearer. When one object partially covers another, we perceive the overlapped object as being closer and the object that covers it as being further away. For instance, if you see a person standing in front of a tree, you perceive the person as closer because they partially overlap with the tree. Now, the relative height. Now, among similar objects, those that appear closer to the horizon are perceived to be further away. The relative height and the diagonal lines within objects can create an illusion of depth or motion, which allow our brain to interpret a two-dimensional image as having three-dimensional depth. By understanding these cues, we can perceive depth and create a sense of three-dimensionality in two-dimensional image. Then there is something called perspective. So what is perspective? When a parallel line in a scene appears to be converging in the image, they are perceived as vanishing in the distance. When objects or lines in a picture or painting seem to converge towards a common point in the distance, we refer to this point as the vanishing point. This creates the perception of depth and adds a three-dimensional quality to the image. For example, let's say you are standing in a field and there are two trees in front of you. The tree that is closer to you appears bigger, while the tree that is farther away looks smaller. This is an example of how our perception of size can be influenced by distance. Now let's talk about shadowing and shading. It is the configuration that provides information about an object's depth. Shadows and shading provides important visual signals for perceiving depth and the three-dimensional qualities of objects. When light falls on an object, it creates areas of light and shadow. The variation in brightness and darkness helps our brain perceive the contours, shapes, and textures of objects. Shadows and shading provides visual cues for perceiving the three-dimensional qualities of objects by showing variation in light and darkness. So, perceiving distance requires depth cues. Now, how does the depth cue really work? An experiment was done by someone called Eleanor Gibson, and she created something called a visual cliff experiment. So, monocular cues are the depth cues that can be perceived using only one eye. These cues provide us with information about depth and distance. We already talked about monocular cue. Now we will discuss binocular cues. So what Eleanor Gibson's idea was, she designed an experiment which is called the visual cliff experiment. So what was the experiment? A small baby was put on a visual cliff platform, and now this is the hypothetical visual cliff. It is an illusion and there is no depth. You can see this is a depth, but this is not actually a depth, and so the child was put on an area like that and the child was crawling. Now it was seen that when the child came near the edge, and this edge seems like it is going to fall, and the child stopped moving, which basically means that he can perceive depth. He can see and feel that I will fall. and that is called a visual clip experiment. Now the child is not moving further. So this is an illusion that has been done. This part is an illusion which seems like a depth, but it is not. And so the child exactly does not move out or does not come back or does not fall. So this experiment is known as the visual cliff experiment, which was conducted by Eleanor Gibson. She shows that even at young age, babies can perceive depth and understand that they might fall if they continue crawling. In the visual cliff experiment, the baby relied on a binocular cue, which means this baby used both eyes to perceive depth. Let's understand binocular cues for perceiving depth. We need both of our eyes to use these cues. So firstly, retinal disparity. So in retinal disparity, an object comes closer to us, the differences in images between our eyes becomes greater. For example, close one of your eyes and hold your hand in front of your face. Notice that when you close the left eye first and then the right eye, the position of your hand appears to shift slightly. This is because each eye provides a different view of the object and creating a depth effect. This phenomenon is known as retinal disparity, which is a binocular cue for perceiving depth. So binocular cues like retinal disparity require both of the eyes working together to perceive depth and accurately interpret objects in our environment. By combining the information from both eyes, our brain can calculate distances and create a three-dimensional perception of the world around us. Now, convergence. So convergence is a binocular cue that helps us perceive depth. In convergence, an object comes closer to our eyes and our eyes have to come together to keep focused on the object. It occurs when an object moves closer to us, causing our eyes to adjust and turn inward to maintain focus on the object. This inward movement of the eyes is called convergence. For example, when we watch 3D movies with those special glasses, each eye sees a slightly different picture. This tricks our eyes into thinking that objects in the movie are really close or far away. It makes the movie look more realistic and gives us a sense of depth. When we watch something is moving in front of us, like a person is walking, then our two eyes work together to see it from different angles. Each eye receives a slightly different image due to its unique position. These different views are then combined in our brain and allowing us to see the motion happening. Let's say you are watching a person walking from left to right, and then your left eye sees one view and your right eye sees a slightly different view. Your brain puts these views together and that's how you perceive the person's movement. Having two eyes that can see different perspectives helps us to understand perception of motion. Now let's consider what would happen if we had only one eye. If you cover one of your eyes and try to perceive the same motion, you will notice that the sense of motion becomes less apparent. Without the input from both eyes, our brain lacks the necessary information to accurately perceive the motion of the object that are nearby. Now, one example that shows how we perceive motion is the stroboscopic effect, also called the flip book effect. Imagine having a book with many cartoons inside, and when you flip through the pages repeatedly, the static images give the illusion of continuous movement. This happens because our two eyes capture the series of images and our brain merges them together and creating the perception of motion. The binocular cues from both eyes are essential in making this effect possible. Now, another example that demonstrates our ability to perceive motion is the pie phenomenon. Now, imagine a red object moving across a white background. So when we observe this, we experience the illusion of motion. This illusion is created by the binocular cues provided by our two eyes. our brain combines the slightly different perspective from each of eyes and leading to the perception of motion. The stroboscopic effect and the pie phenomenon are just two examples that highlight how our binocular cues enable us to experience artificial motion. Our brain's ability to combine the different perspectives from our two eyes allow us to perceive motion and enjoy the dynamic nature of the visual world around us. Now there is another interesting way, and this says that we can perceive motion through a special effect called the autokinetic effect. Imagine being in a dark room and looking at a tiny bright light. After some time, you might start to see the light moving, even though it's actually not. This happens because our two eyes work together to create the illusion of motion. It's like the light is moving all by itself, even though it's not really going anywhere. The autokinetic effect shows us how our eyes team up to make us think something is moving when it is actually still. So, just like how a flip book creates the illusion of motion by quickly flipping through still pictures, the autokinetic effect tricks us into thinking something is moving when it's actually not. Our eyes and brain are pretty amazing at making us to see things that are not really there. Alright, so let's do a quick recap of what we have covered in today's lecture. We have covered the fascinating topic of perception and how does perception really progress, and then we looked at what is the need of perception by presenting several pieces of evidence and examples. Then we studied the purpose of perception. In our next lecture, we will study the rest of the three functions of perception. In today's lecture, we looked at the first two functions of perception, starts with attention and localization. Also, we covered the idea of what is attention. We also learned about different types of attention and how the process of attention works. Then we looked at the process of localization, which is locating an object in the external environment in terms of not only grouping objects together, but also in terms of figure ground effect, which helps us distinguish objects from their background. In addition to localization, we also looked at how does the eye perceive distance, and not only distance, how does the eye manage 3D images. We introduced the concepts of monocular cues and binocular cues, which provide valuable information for perceiving distances and perceiving motion. And also, how does the motion is perceived. We also studied stroboscopic effect, phi phenomenon, and autokinetic effect to learn perceived motion. Now we will pause here and continue our exploration in the next lecture, and in the upcoming lecture we will study the rest of the three functions of perceptions, which are recognition, constancy, and abstraction. We will learn how these processes work together to form our perception of the world. So stay curious and keep exploring the wonders of perception. So till then, goodbye.